Nasal septum's nerve supply can be divided mainly into three types. Number one is sensory nerve supply. Number two is special sensory nerve supply. And number three, autonomic nerve supply of nasal septum. The sensory nerve supply of nasal septum primarily comes from the branches of trigeminal nerve. So you see, this is trigeminal nerve and it is giving three branches. The three sensory divisions. Number one is the ophthalmic division, number two is the maxillary division, and number three is the mandibular division. So the sensory nerve supply of nasal septum primarily comes from the branches of trigeminal nerve, specifically the maxillary division and ophthalmic division. The nasopalatine nerve, a branch of maxillary nerves. So this is the posterior portion. This is mainly the nasopalatine nerve. It is giving branches to the posterior part of the nasal septum, and this is the anterior part of the nasal septum. So the posterior nasopalatine nerve, that is a branch of maxillary division of nasal of a trigeminal nerve. So mainly the anterior division is anterior part of the nasal septum is supplied by the anterior ethmoidal nerve, and at anterior ethmoidal nerve is a branch of ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerves. So here we discuss the sensation or the sensory nerve supply of nasal septum. Now we discuss the second part of the nerve supply of nasal septum, that is special sensory nerve supply. As we all know that the main function of the nose is to receive olfaction or the odors from the environment, and this this superior most part of the nasal septum is responsible to carry special senses, that is the senses of olfaction from the mucosa of the nasal septum. So almost 20 branches of small olfactory nerves pierce through this cribriform plate of ethmoid bone, and then they enter into the brain, where these olfactory nerves are gathered and their sensations are taken to the olfactory bulb, and from the olfactory bulb it goes towards the center of olfaction in the brain. So olfactory nerve provides the special senses of smell to the upper portion of the nasal septum. Fibers pass from receptors. So as I told you that the olfactory nerves are about 20 in number, and they pass from the receptors in the olfactory epithelium of the upper part of the nasal septum and medial wall of the superior turbinate through this cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone to the olfactory bulb. Second order neurons run from this bulb. These are second order neurons. They run from the olfactory bulb in the olfactory tract and eventually to cortical centers in the dentate and semilunate gyri. So in the brain, dentate and semilunate gyri receive the olfactory tract, and second order neurons are taken to this part of the brain. Olfactory nerve pathway. Here we discuss briefly the components of olfactory nerve pathway. Olfactory receptor cells, then the olfactory nerve, then this olfactory bulb, then olfactory tract, and afterwards olfactory striae, then olfactory cortex, and olfactory cortex output structures. So here we complete the sense of olfaction or the special nerve supply, that is the nerve supply that is carried by the cranial nerve 1, olfactory nerve. And now we discuss the third part of the nerve supply, that is the autonomic nerve supply of nasal. Now let's discuss the third part of the nervous system of the nasal septum. Nasal septum receives autonomic nerve supply from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic fibers cause vasoconstriction and reduce secretions. They originate in the first 5 segments. So the sympathetic fibers originate from the first 5 segments of the upper part of the thoracic spinal cord, and then they synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. So these are the sympathetic fibers. So the nasal septum receives autonomic nerve supply from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So this portion is the sympathetic and the other portion is the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic fibers cause vasoconstriction and reduce secretion. They originate in the first 5 segments of the thoracic spine. So these are the first 5 segments of the thoracic spinal cord and synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. So this is superior cervical ganglion, and after originating from the first 5 segments of spinal cord, they synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. Postganglionic fibers reach target sites by running with the blood vessels. So these postganglionic fibers run with the blood vessels. So sympathetic preganglionic fibers originate in the upper thoracic spinal cord, that is from T1 to T4. From T1 to T4, they ascend through the sympathetic chain, and then this is the sympathetic chain, and they are ascending through this sympathetic chain, and ultimately they synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. The postganglionic fibers follow a complex pathway. These are the postganglionic fibers, and then they follow a complex path, ultimately forming a plexus around the internal carotid artery. So they form a plexus around the internal carotid artery, and then they enter into the nasal cavity via the Vidian nerve. So the function of the sympathetic stimulation is to cause vasoconstriction in the nasal mucosa, reducing blood flow and congestion. This helps regulate airflow and maintain the normal state of nasal mucosa. So this is the sympathetic pathway of the autonomic nervous system. Now let's discuss the parasympathetic innervation. The parasympathetic nerve supply to the nose originates from the superior salivary nucleus in the brain stem. The parasympathetic nerve supply to the nose originates from the superior salivary nucleus. This is superior salivary nucleus in the brain stem. It is present in the brain stem. This is the part of brain, and this superior salivary nucleus is present in the brain stem, that is responsible for the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. They travel through the facial nerve. So these parasympathetic fibers travel through the facial nerve via the greater petrosal nerve. So this is mainly greater petrosal nerve. It is coming from the superior salivary nucleus with the facial nerve, and then synapse at the pterygopalatine ganglion. So this is pterygopalatine ganglion. So, and in pterygopalatine ganglion, the greater petrosal nerve and synapse at the pterygopalatine ganglion. From there, or from the pterygopalatine ganglion, fibers which are carried by the maxillary nerves. So now from the pterygopalatine ganglion, the fibers of parasympathetic nervous system are carried by the maxillary nerve. That is a branch of trigeminal nerve, as we discussed in our previous picture. So this is basically the maxillary nerve, that is a branch of trigeminal nerve. Nervous system, after originating from the superior salivary nucleus, run through the greater petrosal nerve with facial nerve, and then they synapse at the pterygopalatine ganglion, and from pterygopalatine ganglion, postganglionic fibers are carried by the maxillary nerve, a branch of trigeminal nerve, provide parasympathetic innervation to the nasal glands, causing increased secretions and dilatation of blood vessels. They synapse in the sphenopalatine ganglion. The postganglionic parasympathetic fibers innervate nasal glands and potentially contribute to capacitance vessel dilatation. The functions of parasympathetic activity primarily controls secretion by the nasal glands, contributing to nasal mucus production. The parasympathetic nerves also play a role in regulating blood vessel capacitance, which can contribute to nasal congestion or relaxation. So here we complete the nerve supply of nasal septum.